Hello everyone and welcome back to Little Quilter. Today we're going to be loading the Reindeer Crossings quilt onto the Longarm and we're going to be starting quilting it. So as I do that, I wanted to talk to you guys about a few things that I think about as I load my quilt onto the Longarm and how I decide how I'm going to load my quilt on the Longarm. So the four things that you need to think about, or that I think about when I'm loading my quilt on my Longarm machine, is one, is any of my fabric directional? Two, the sizing of my quilt. Three, the design choice, whether that's free motion or pantograph quilting. And number four is, am I going to float my quilt top or am I going to use the quilt bar? So let's go into those. The first one, direction of the fabric, is the easiest one. So if you have a fabric that is directional, meaning that there are parts of the design that you want to be straight up and down. So in the example of the Reindeer Crossing quilt, it's going to be the backing of the fabric is directional and that there are words and there are pictures of like Santa and ribbons and stuff that would look better if they are facing up and down versus me being upside down or the quilt backing being upside down. So I do want the direction of the fabric to go in line with the quilt top. My quilt top is also directional because it's reindeers. So we don't want the reindeers upside down on the quilt. So lining those up whenever I'm pinning them to my quilt leaders is very important. So the second part is sizing of the fabric, and that may be a little bit mystifying to some people of why it would matter, but the primary reason for that is that if I can, I would like to load my quilt so that the shortest part of the quilt is going up on the take-up bar. And that's because the more quilt that goes up onto the take-up bar, the smaller my quilting area gets. So if you have a really, really large quilt and you have a 18-inch throat space, you don't have one of those bigger ones or even a smaller one. Like I know there's some that have like a 16, the Sweet 16. So I know there are some like the Sweet 16 that has only a 16-inch throat space. Doing a really large quilt could get a little bit difficult to complete all of your quilting or getting a lot of quilting done in a decent space because your take-up bar is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. Example being that if you have a quilt that is 60 by 50, I'm going to want to load it with the 50 going up the take-up bar, right? 50 inches going up the take-up bar, because that's at least 10 inches that I don't have to worry about. They're just on the sides of my bar going up, right? So the third most important thing here is going to be the design choice of quilting. So whether you are doing free motion quilting or pantograph quilting is going to make a decision on how you might want to load your quilt. Sometimes you still don't get a choice. If you're using something that is very directional, like a pantograph, then that may limit how you can load your quilt because you don't want, you may not want something running horizontal down your quilt and across whenever it's really more of a directional, so it should be going from the top down, right? And that would be the case with this. So my quilt backing, my quilt top, and my pantograph are all directional. I need to have them going in the same direction. So for me, what that means is that I either have to load my quilt top if I'm at the front of my machine, load that quilt top with the reindeer looking at me, or I'm going to have to load that quilt top with the reindeer looking towards the back of the machine. And the same thing for my backing fabric. It's either got to be looking at me from the front or looking at me from the back. And I want to make sure that those are going in the same direction. And that way, whenever I quilt my design, it will be in the correct direction. Now, I like to, whenever I'm using a directional pantograph, I do like to start at the very top of my quilt. That does mean that a lot of times I have to quilt that design upside down. It really doesn't bother me. I'm just following a line. I'm not even really thinking about the actual overall design when I'm doing the pantograph. But if that bothers you, then you should probably load your quilt backwards, and so that whenever you are at the back of the machine, your quilt is looking at you. That does mean that you are going to start from the bottom of your quilt and work up to the top. I don't prefer to do this because I feel like the top of the quilt is going to be looked at a lot more. So I want to make sure that when I'm starting that part of my pantograph, it is nice and even across the top. And that doesn't always happen when you're using a pantograph, that at the end of that quilt that you get a nice even layer. You might just get like a partial layer, right? So I try to avoid that if I can. Now, if you are using free motion quilting designs, you may have a lot more freedom to load your quilt in whatever direction that you want to. Example for me though, where I did want to do it directional would be a lot of times depending on the background. So for the red sampler quilt, I could have loaded that quilt in any direction because the background was not directional. It was just the little seashell swirls and circles. I don't care what direction I'm in, that's going to look fine. The other side of that would be the armadillo quilt. The armadillo quilt had vertical stripes on it that were a lot easier to do if the quilt was loaded horizontally, so that I could do an entire stripe down the entire quilt rather than having to do a partial stripe and then roll my quilt up and continue that line. So that would be an example where loading your quilt top would be important for it to be directional so that you can have an easier time quilting it, even though you're doing free motion quilting. And then the last thing I'm going to talk to you guys about is the floating a quilt. I personally do not float my quilts, and basically what that means is that you don't use that quilt bar. There's your take-up bar, the belly bar, and then there's the quilt top bar. And if you are floating your quilt, you do not use the quilt top bar. You just set your quilt on top of you have your backing, your quilt batting, and then you just actually lay the quilt top on top of it and hold it in place. I personally do not like this because I'm afraid that it's going to move. Some people that do this will actually use quilt clips on their backing bar or the belly bar, where they can sort of make sure to keep it in line depending on, so if you had 12-inch quilt blocks, maybe they would put a quilt clip that starts at the edge and at every 12-inch mark, so that as they move the quilt, they can make sure that it is straight. That just seems like a lot of work to me. I like to do my work on the front end and then just really enjoy my quilting. So I always put my quilt top on my quilt bar and take care that whenever I'm rolling that quilt up, that I am keeping it straight and the edges of the quilt bar where the quilt ends are staying consistent. We're not getting it like rolling this way or rolling that way. It's nice and straight as I roll it up. And that way, as I progress through the quilt, all I have to really do is just look to make sure I don't have any wrinkles in the fabric, smooth everything out, and then continue quilting. I think this is really nice when you're doing a pantograph because I don't have to really, I can't see the front of my quilt whenever I'm doing a pantograph without looking up, and then I can't do the pantograph. So you would have to start and stop a lot to make sure. Some people have this down to an art. It works wonderful for them. They don't have to take the time to load their quilt top onto their quilt bar, and they feel like they can get to quilting faster. I feel like it would give me a little bit more anxiety to have it just free floating, and I would be checking it so much during the quilting that it would be too interruptive for my quilting style. I want to get it on there and then just go to town on quilting. So those are the things that I am thinking about whenever I load my quilt top, and hopefully that helps you guys. So if I have already finished loading that, let's get back to actually doing the quilt. Okay, so we are 2 rows into this, well, almost 2 rows completed into the Reindeer Crossing quilt with the pantograph. And this pantograph is a little bit more intense than the other one, so it seems to be taking a little bit longer to do it. I feel like it's a lot more dense than the previous Pantograph. I still think it looks good. Yeah, it's just a lot more dense. So I'll show you guys that. And then the other thing that I'm just not sure about, which I really had a pretty difficult time at choosing the thread for this one. So I wasn't totally sold on the thread. And I think the hardest part is just on the actual really dark spots. So like on the nose and the reindeer itself versus the rest of the background, it looks really fine. It just pops a lot more in those places. And maybe once all of them are done, that will look a lot better to me. It's just hard right now seeing it. So I don't really know that I could change color because then I would have to, yeah, there's no way that I could change color and do a pantograph. So it has to be all that same color. And I certainly don't want to do brown all over the gray white area. So I think the color choice just is what it is. And it'll probably look a lot better once I get done with it. So, and like somebody said in one of the other videos, the glide foot is definitely a must for doing pantographs. If you don't have a glide foot and you're wanting to do pantographs, you need to purchase one for your long arm. It just helps it to go on and off your quilt without catching anything. Now, I obviously go through and go down my quilt and stitch it down before I start doing the pantograph anyways, but just in case you hit a point where you haven't done that, so if you for some reason moved it up and got right here, it wouldn't catch this and pull it up and flip it over, which would not be great for your quilting. And so as you can see here, it's definitely a lot more noticeable of the quilt design itself on the actual reindeer than it is as much noticeable on here. Again, I'm not really sure that there would have been, short of doing different thread and therefore designing free motion quilting on here. I don't think there was really another option. Okay, so some of you guys may be going, well, why didn't you just free motion quilt it? And that's a great question. I did almost think of free motion quilting it whenever I wasn't sure if the size of this pantograph was going to work well for my machine, but it is actually smaller than the previous design. I think it's like 10, let me look. Yeah, so it is a 10-inch wide pattern, and this quilt is actually shorter than the Harry Potter quilt, so I don't think I'll have an issue with finishing it with this type of pattern. But I saw this pantograph last Christmas and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to do pantographs, because I thought that this little elf gnome pattern was just so pretty and so cute. And so I really wanted to do it on a quilt, and that was my goal with this. So when I purchased this quilt, in my mind, this pantograph was already on the quilt. And so I really had, even whenever I thought about maybe free motion quilting it, I had a really hard time at picturing anything on this quilt, and everything that I put on there just looked weird and not right. And I think that's just because the whole process of making this quilt and piecing it, in my head, this pattern was on there. And so to suddenly change that just really, it really didn't jive well for my brain. So yeah, I think it's going to look great, and it's going to go to a family member anyways. So doing, again, really intricate, detailed quilting, sometimes I'm not saying that family members aren't worth detailed, intricate quilting. They certainly are, but this is basically going to be a secret Santa gift that people are probably going to throw on their sofa or something around the holidays. So I don't expect it to be anything just like super duper crazy. But also it's really cute. So I think they'll really like the design anyway. So yeah. And then I've got one other thing here. Let me show you. Okay, so here's the design, and as you can see, it's upside down. And again, that's because my quilt is directional, like I talked about. If you look up here, the quilt is going this way. So if I was actually quilting this free motion, I would be up front looking at the quilt as it's rolling towards me. So I want to make sure that my pattern is going in the same direction, because we don't want these guys upside down. That would look a little weird, I think. And then of course I've got my background here, which again is also directional. So as it's rolling up with the quilt in the same direction. And isn't this background super cute? So it's a completely different line, and It's just a little bit different, but I thought with all of the like reindeer stuff, I just sort of went really well with the reindeers up top. So this was just a very random fabric purchase. I will link what it is because I can't remember what the name of this pattern is, but I really think it's so cute. It's very, it seems very antique-y to me. Okay, now the actual thing that I wanted to show you guys here was this right here. So what I am doing is as I am quilting, if I have a glitch, so you guys know I talked about this in the last pantograph, I am marking it with an X. So if it's a decent enough one where I noticed it and it was bad, I'm going to mark it with an X. And basically I'm trying to see if it's something that's repeatable in that area to kind of take note so that I can see if this is just the table or was it just that there was a big bunch of fabric in that area, right? And so I've definitely noticed that spot. I noticed it once, and then if we come down here, I noticed it over in this area. Now I know this is not right on the line, and I don't want it to be right on the line because I don't want to distract myself too much when I'm trying to follow this line, okay? Now, the other thing that I thought I would show you guys here, I know I keep adding things, is my tape. So I actually do tape on both ends of the quilt. So I have one here and there's one on the other side. And this is how I know where I need to roll up the quilt. And I don't like wasting time and stopping and starting and then running the quilt down and going back in this direction. So this way I move back and forth and quilt in both directions. And I think that that probably just saves a little bit of time of moving the machine so much and going up, you know, just readjusting it. But basically when you set this up, this is about 1/4 of an inch right here off of the quilt so that whenever I'm going up and down this right here, I'm actually off of my quilt so I don't have to worry about it being perfectly straight. And then we've got it marked around the same area, right? So if you look here, this line goes right into the circle and this half circle here. And so the same area is this part right here. And that's how I know where I need to roll my quilt up. So I should end right here. And then when I actually move this entire quilt, so when I roll this up, the laser light should go from 2 all the way back down to 1. And I'll re-explain that on the other side. Again, just to double down over here. So this is a completely different design that you're seeing than the other side. And so I've got one which is ending right here on this little leaf, and I end it here because that's as far back on that square. Like if this were my quilt at the very beginning, this was that corner edge right here. And so this corner edge is in compliance with the corner of the quilt top. And then what I've done is I've marked the same exact spot all the way up here. And that way, again, when I end on this side, I will end at 2. And then whenever I move the quilt up, I should start at 1. Now, when I say I start at 1, that doesn't mean I'm doing this right here, okay? My needle stops here. I roll the quilt up and I go along this. Remember, this line right here is off of my quilt top. I go up here. I actually bypass this because that's the big line to go into the main pantograph. And I just go up this line and start up here, finish out this quilting area, right? So I'll do this area, go all the way around, come down here, quilt all of this, quilt this, come down, and then I really start into the main body of the pantograph here. I just want to make sure I get all of these in as a succinct and concise pathway rather than starting here and realizing, oh, shenanigans, I never got to this, right? So this 1 and 2 is just about moving the pantograph. Or rolling the quilt up. It has really nothing to do with actually where I'm going to start my pantograph. This is just when I end, I will be here and I will roll it all the way down to 1 so that I know I have the correct spacing between each row. And that's all there is. So let's jump into more quilting. Okay, so I'm on the last, maybe the next to last row, and rolling it up has been a little bit of a challenge because I've started dealing with the bar. I didn't really have to deal with this in my last one, so I'm not sure what I did exactly different, but I have made some adjustments. However, this last row that I started, when I checked it, I feel like it's too far, and so I'm going to unpick it and adjust where I start my quilt again, just to see if I can get the placement right, just because I feel like the rest of the quilt has been really close together, and now this one is a little bit farther spaced out, so it's just going to be a lot more noticeable than I would like it to be. So I'm going to work on unpicking it. So, and I quickly just want to show you guys, this was my original line here, this 1 and 2 of whenever I started the Pantograph. And as I progressed through it, really not that far into it, of rolling this up, and I mean, this is only one thickness of batting. I'm using Quilter's Deluxe poly batting, and I mean, regular fabric, nothing thick, no minky, nothing. And I quickly found that whenever I rolled it up, this was as far back as I could get it to go. And so I just adjusted my pantograph so it went up to here, and I just went up to here on this. So you can see it really ends up hitting. So we have like this part of the leaf. I end up hitting the same place, and I think that helps me to maintain that consistency whenever I roll the quilt up, that my spacing is still appropriate. But that didn't work for this last roll up. I think it just started to get really tight, and so it popped it a little bit forward once I actually lifted my needle. So we're going to correct that. Okay, everybody, we have unpicked the part at the front that we quilted over the reindeer that was not spaced properly, and I have got it adjusted, I think. So I'm going to show you how I figured out how to adjust this. So if you run into it, you can adjust it on your machine and make your marks, okay? All right, so here's my machine, and you can see here is the back of the quilting here. And just as a reference point, it's a nice reference point, this is one of the tops of the hat, and here is one of the feet. And so this is how much space we have between that as we moved through this quilt, okay? And so you can look down here, you have that similar spacing of there is the top of the hat and there is the foot. So this is the ghost row. So this is what's supposed to be on that last row before you move on to your actual pantograph row. Now, this is where I tried to stop, and because of how close my machine is, it basically stopped there, I believe, but then whenever I pulled my needle up, it pushed it forward, and that caused the spacing to get off. So what I have done is I went back and basically right here, so let me show you. So basically I looked what was the last thing that I'd quilted here, and it was this right here. And so I matched this to the ghost pantograph with my laser light and with my needle. So basically I moved my machine, and I would like to show you this, but I can't do this simultaneously with the machine, so I'm just going to have to explain it for you. So I moved my needle to where it was sitting over this point here, and then on the back of the machine, what I did was I moved this, and I can actually do this now. So then I moved my machine so that it was in that same spot right there, and adjusted the laser light so that it hit that point right there on the ghost pantograph. And then I just ran it over here, dropped my needle because I have my drop needle position back here, and marked a line. Now what I can do is I can count here, and I can get my marker and I can go, okay, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4 up from the last position that I was starting at. So this is my new number 1. And then if we go up here, we have to go up. So we're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. So this right here will be my new number 2. Okay, and I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of how fast I am actually moving my pantograph in real time, because I think that's important. When we do it in the time-lapse mode, obviously you guys don't want to watch me quilt this quilt for the amount of actual hours that it takes me to quilt, but I do think it's hard to know from that how fast am I actually moving my machine, and I do think that is such an important part of doing pantographs and quilting pantographs, that you need to figure out that speed that works best for you. And I do think that that probably varies between each type of pantograph, if you're doing a lot of swirls or if you're doing a lot of straight line quilting, but this is how fast I am actually doing this pantograph. Okay, everybody, we have got one more row to do. And actually, I think it's pretty super lucky because I'm going to be able to use the ghost row on the very top of the pantograph. So let me show you so I can explain further. Here is the last bit of quilting, and I've got this much room left. So as you can see, there's not that much room left on here. So let's go to the back of the quilt. Okay, so here we are on the back of the quilt, and as we had previously marked, right, this would have been my stopping part of rolling the quilt up all the way to here, but as I was looking at it, you know, this is how much space is left, and so I thought, well, let me look and see, and if you look, that's the edge, so my needle is down. I went ahead and just ran the machine up to see how far up I would be able to quilt before I hit my bar here. And I have like a decent bit of space. So what, I can fit my hand through here. And my laser light is ending at the edge of the quilt. And that's perfect. Isn't that perfect? So I actually don't have to, in this instance, go through here and mark my top line. This is going to be my top line, and I'm just going to go through and do these little bits right here to go ahead and finish off this quilt, which is great. That worked out perfectly. I couldn't have done that better. It's all an accident. I didn't do anything purposefully, but that's okay. We'll accept it. So I'm going to run this. This should be pretty quick. And this sucker's going to be done. That's excellent. Okay, everybody, we have finished this beautiful pantograph. Quilting is completely done. So now all I have to do is take it off of the quilt and get the binding on. I am so excited about this. So this quilt is for a December gift, obviously, with the reindeers and all of the Christmas accoutrements that go with it. And I'm so excited that it is just the beginning of November and I have finally got it finished. All right, beautiful people, let's see what we've got here. We'll go up to our top button here. So this quilt took me 3 hours, 10 minutes, and 23 seconds. And it was only 167,983 stitches, so not too shabby there. I hope that you guys have enjoyed all of this process of the pantograph quilting. I think this is going to be a longer video. For those of you that have stuck with me through the whole thing, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your comments, and as always, I hope that you guys look forward to my quilt review and going over this quilt, and have a wonderful day.